Welcome to Wandering Scribe. This is a recap of Return of the Blossoming Blade. Disclaimer. All rights belong to the original authors and publishers. Only the narration and production are my own. Enjoy the story. Preface. Chung Myung stood alone amidst the ruins of a battlefield drenched in red. The once lush peak of the 100,000 mountains had lost all its life, replaced by carnage and the silent testimony of sacrifice. His body, broken and torn, hardly registered pain. His soul had been shattered long before his flesh. A jagged sword jutted from his shoulder, a hole the size of an infant's head opened in his torso, and his left arm was gone. He dragged his feet across the crimson-soaked earth, the weight of grief heavier than his wounds. All of Mount Hua Sect had fallen, his seniors, juniors, and fellow disciples. Promises of shared futures and eternal brotherhood lay broken beside their still bodies. There was no one left to honor their sacrifice. He looked forward and saw the source of it all. The heavenly demon, perpetrator of the massacre, sat calmly in a pool of devastation, pierced by countless blades and spears. Even in death, he exuded a chilling calm. A war that had consumed the finest warriors ended here, with neither glory nor peace. Chung Myung's rage surged. His sword, pulled from his own flesh, trembled in his grip. He stepped forward. Another step. One more. Each one an act of defiance against death. The demon's eyes opened, hollow and fading, yet brimming with a promise of destruction to come. He warned of the return of darkness, of demons that would rise again. Chung Myung ended him with a single, final blow. The head fell. The nightmare was over. But there was no triumph. No cheers. Only silence. As he collapsed, Chung Myung looked to the sky, unmoved, eternally blue, as though mocking the sacrifices made below. Mount Hua Sect had been extinguished. Its greatest generation wiped out in one final stand. Perhaps children remained, unknowing, too young to remember. He had regrets. Endless, gnawing regrets. Regrets for not being stronger, for not heeding his masters, for failing those who looked up to him. He wept, not for himself, but for them. For the brothers and sisters who'd followed him into the abyss. For the legacy now buried in blood and silence. Chung Myung, the Plum Blossom Sword Saint, 13th disciple of Mount Hua Sect, who felled the heavenly demon in the twilight of a dying era, closed his eyes beneath the indifferent sky. And the plum blossoms fell. Chapter 1. Suspended between death and something else, Chung Myung drifted through the fragments of memory. Faces from the Mount Hua Sect surfaced, teachers, fellow disciples, moments of training, and rebellion. Regret clouded it all. He had once scoffed at their teachings, believing power alone was enough. Only now did he see the truth. But realization came too late. He heard a familiar voice, his beloved Sayang, warm and calm. The presence brought brief peace, but then everything shattered. Pain exploded through his skull. He wasn't dead. Not yet. But this agony wasn't from battle. It was a crude, unrelenting kind, unlike any sword wound. He jolted awake to find himself on the receiving end of a beating. The attacker? A ragged beggar swinging a bamboo stick. Confused and stunned, Chung Myung reached up, expecting the strength of a seasoned warrior. But his arms moved sluggishly, his limbs frail and short. When he looked at his hand, it was not his own. It belonged to a child. The blows rained down harder, and his pride took a deeper hit than his body. Never before, even in Mount Hua's harshest training, had he suffered such humiliation. He could hardly believe it. He, once feared across the land, now lay curled up in the dirt, being scolded and beaten by a filthy street beggar. When the assault ended, he limped toward a riverbank. The reflection staring back was not his. The face was young, unfamiliar, and thin, charming, perhaps, but not his own. His soul now lived in the body of a starving child. He stared into the water, stunned. Gone was the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. In his place stood a boy barely strong enough to lift a hand. Was this sorcery? Reincarnation? A trick from the heavenly demon? Theories raced through his mind, but none changed the reality. Every throb in his battered body screamed that this was no dream. Though furious, he held on to a single, undeniable truth: he was alive. That meant he still had a chance. A second life, whatever the reason, had been forced upon him. He didn't know how or why, but he would find out. And first, he'd deal with that bamboo stick-wielding beggar. His body may have changed, but his pride, his spirit, and his resolve were still those of Chung Myung. The world had not seen the last of the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. Chapter 2. Chung Myung, once a revered swordsman, awoke in the filth of a beggar's tent, bruised, disoriented, and surrounded by scraps for clothes. His mind raced as memories clashed with the grim reality around him. A nearby beggar, Guchil, watched with concern. Cho Sam, as the boy was called now, had clearly lost his grip. He questioned everything: his identity, the time, even the very air he breathed. With each answer Guchil offered, Cho Sam's confusion deepened. 100 years had passed since the fall of the heavenly demon. Time had not merely moved forward, it had left him behind. The Beggar's Union, where he now found himself, was no haven. It was a scattered net of the forgotten, barely surviving. Names were reduced to numbers, and even memory felt rationed. But the blow came when Cho Sam asked about the Mount Hua Sect. No one seemed to know it. To the people on the streets, it was a relic, if not a myth. Once one of the most prestigious sects, Mount Hua was now lost in obscurity, replaced by lesser names in the ranks of the martial world's elite. Chung Myung's heart sank. The sect he bled for, the legacy he helped shape, had vanished from history like smoke in wind. Even the beggars laughed at the idea of Mount Hua being part of the great sects. To them, it was forgotten rubble in a remote province. Unable to accept this truth, Cho Sam scoured the streets, desperate for a spark of recognition, a whisper of Mount Hua's name. But every encounter ended the same: confusion, mockery, or indifference. At last, he found a sliver of information. Mount Hua had been known, once. Revered. But after the war with the heavenly demon, it crumbled. Its elite, wiped out. Its name, buried under time and silence. Rage and sorrow warred in his chest. This could not be how the legacy ended. This was not how Mount Hua should be remembered. Fueled by burning determination, Chung Myung made his choice. He would go to Mount Hua. Not just to see it, but to raise it from its ashes. His blood was still Mount Hua's. And so long as he drew breath, the sect would not be forgotten. Chapter 3. Chung Myung's sudden declaration left Guchil in stunned silence. The man had stormed out of the tent ranting, only to return with grand claims of heading to Mount Hua. Despite his battered appearance and wild tone, there was something sincere behind his words. Guchil couldn't explain why he listened, only that he felt compelled to. Chung Myung left him with a strange parting, an impassioned promise to repay kindness and a warning that his name, Chung Myung of Mount Hua, would not be forgotten. Then he left. And returned. Then left again. Each time with another erratic outburst, asking for directions, the name of the man who had beaten him, or spouting odd declarations. It was chaos, yet oddly purposeful. Guchil could only shake his head, muttering that if Chung Myung got caught by Wang Cho, he wouldn't survive. Out in the world again, Chung Myung ran. Or tried to. In his previous life, his legs had been fast enough to shame horses. Now, just a short sprint left him collapsing, gasping for breath. The frail body he now inhabited was barely holding together. He was skin and bone, utterly drained of energy. His once legendary endurance was now a fading memory. And he had planned to reach Shaanxi? Lying flat on the ground, he laughed bitterly. He wasn't even close to ready. But deep within that weakened shell still burned the will of a master swordsman. If he was to reach Mount Hua, his first step had to be rebuilding his strength from the ground up. He remembered the regrets of his past life, the rushed training, the neglected basics, the lost comrades. This time would be different. No masters to please. No competitions to rush. No ego to feed. He would rebuild from the foundation, slowly and perfectly. A foundation like no other, one strong enough to carry a tower that could not fall. He left the town behind, seeking isolation. In the quiet forest, beneath the shade of towering trees, he sat cross-legged. It was time. Time to create a new Dantian. Time to reignite his inner strength. His mind swirled with countless martial techniques, but he chose only one. The equilibrium of 6. For the first time since his rebirth, his voice rang out clear and steady. Not shaken. Not confused. Just certain. His journey had truly begun. Chapter 4. Chung Myung sat cross-legged, surrounded by dust and tattered robes, recalling a technique many had discarded as useless, the equilibrium of 6. Once considered the cheapest and most basic martial art, its true purpose was misunderstood. It didn't strengthen internal energy directly, but it purified the body, refined the Dantian, and laid the groundwork for higher cultivation. Others had abandoned it. Mount Hua taught it out of tradition, barely emphasizing its significance. But Chung Myung knew better. In his previous life, overlooking this method had been his greatest mistake. Now, reborn, he had the chance to correct that failure. Breathing deeply, he guided the flow of qi, not to build power, but to cleanse. Hours passed. Slowly, impurities faded, and what remained was the purest speck of energy, so small it could hardly be called a Dantian. Sweat soaked his body, and exhaustion set in, but he felt something new, a perfect beginning. But perfection came with a cost. Attempting to stand, his legs buckled. His limbs trembled uncontrollably. Internal qi should have brought vigor, but his body refused to move. His foundation was flawless, but fragile. The process had drained every ounce of strength. Then hunger struck. Not the mild discomfort of fasting, but the desperate, hollow ache of true starvation. His stomach twisted in pain. This wasn't like the training fasts he once endured, this was involuntary and unforgiving. Driven by sheer will, Chung Myung staggered toward the nearest village. Each step was a battle. He finally reached the edge of the forest and collapsed on the road, breath ragged, body shaking. The world spun. He had once defeated monstrous foes, stood among the finest of the Mount Hua Sect, but now, hunger might be the end of him. He laughed bitterly, barely able to lift his head. No food, no strength, no energy left to beg or fight. He needed work to earn money for food, but work was impossible in his condition. He groaned, body too weak to continue. His proud past seemed like a distant memory, irrelevant to the desperate boy lying in the dirt. Just as darkness threatened to pull him under, a sound rustled nearby. Once, he was the Plum Blossom Sword Saint, the pride of Mount Hua. Now, Chung Myung lay in the dirt, battered and bruised, mistaken for a dying child. Coins clinked as strangers passed, offering pity for what they saw as a beggar's tragic fate. Though warmth touched his heart, his tears weren't from gratitude. Pride stung deeper than any wound. A disciple of Mount Hua, reduced to this. He swallowed his pride and dumplings alike. Just 3 stuffed his small belly, and he tucked the remaining coins away like precious treasure. In this life, even pocket change felt like wealth. But surviving meant more than eating. He had to reach Mount Hua, a journey of 2,000 miles, one that once took hours, now seemed insurmountable. His new body lacked stamina, strength, and reach. Every plan made with the arrogance of his former self now collapsed under the weight of harsh reality. Before he could move forward, 3 beggars loomed over him, demanding the few coins he'd hidden. Starving and angry, Chung Myung stared at his last dumplings, then set them down with care. What came next was brutal and swift. Despite his weak body, his refined technique made up for it. Fists flew with precision. One collapsed with a crack, another fell under a kick, and the last received blow after blow until he stayed down. It wasn't elegant, but it was enough. Victorious, Chung Myung stood over the groaning men. He demanded directions to Shangxi. Their blank stares said it all. They were useless. With a sigh, he ordered them to leave their coins, and more. Threats from a child wouldn't usually work, but these men had learned better. They emptied their pockets and fled, defeated by a beggar who wasn't a beggar at all. Chung Myung watched them go. This world was strange and cruel, and he was starting from nothing. But even as a child with a broken body and no path, he still carried the pride of Mount Hua. Chapter 5. Chung Myung leaned heavily on his makeshift cane, staring up at the towering form of Mount Hua. His journey had been long and merciless, one marked by hunger, exhaustion, and a frail child's body ill-suited for such trials. Yet here he was. At last. His body ached, his clothes hung in tatters, and every step sent waves of pain through his bones. But none of that mattered. The mountain that once housed his sect now stood before him. The hope of reclaiming what was lost surged in his chest. Determination flared as he began the steep ascent. The climb was brutal. With every desperate grasp on the cliff's edge and every inch forward on trembling limbs, he realized just how formidable Mount Hua truly was without the aid of martial power. Breathless and battered, he finally pulled himself to the summit, clouds far below. There, a dirt path wound toward a familiar peak. His heart raced as he followed it. He caught sight of roof tiles up ahead, the gate of Mount Hua. But something was wrong. The tiles were missing. The pillars, once clean and strong, now stood blackened and cracked. Webs clung to the corners. And the sect's proud signboard, gone. The gate bore no trace of the name Great Mount Hua Sect. Each step forward confirmed the truth. Decay had taken hold of what was once sacred. A place once full of discipline and spirit now reeked of abandonment. Despair settled in. Chung Myung's mind drifted to the past. He remembered the great battle, the sacrifice of the elders, the fall of the disciples, the pride of the sect burned away in the war against the heavenly demon. So few had survived. Too young. Too unprepared. He'd given everything. Died for this. And yet, here stood the remains of all that effort. Forgotten. Shattered. Grief and anger welled up, tightening his chest as he stared at the broken gate. His voice trembled in his head, questioning, cursing, mourning. What had they fought for? Why had it all ended like this? And just as despair threatened to drown him entirely, a voice cut through the silence. Who's there? Chung Myung froze. Chapter 6. Expecting ruins, he was surprised to find life stirring behind its battered gates. A man in a faded black uniform peered out, puzzled by the sight of a lone boy on the mountain trail. Despite Chung Myung's ragged appearance, the man welcomed him with unexpected warmth, concerned for his safety in the cold, descending night. He introduced himself as Am, a martial artist of Mount Hua. Though wary at first, Chung Myung stepped inside, overwhelmed by the strange familiarity of this place that once meant everything to him. Mount Hua still stood, but just barely. The proud blue stone floors, once the pride of his senior Suyong, were gone, replaced by muddy earth. The heavenly golden palace, once the beating heart of the sect, had vanished, leaving only barren land in its place. Even the grand entrance signboard was missing. Chung Myung struggled to breathe, each inhalation filled with dust and disbelief. His heart grew heavier as he followed Am through the crumbling compound. The man's calm sorrow reflected years of loyalty and helplessness. Those who remained had suffered, not from cowardice, but from devotion in the face of ruin. Chung Myung could not fault them. If he had lived through this, would he have stayed? They arrived at the auction temple, the most sacred hall of Mount Hua. Though prepared for decay, the sight still struck him. Gone were the golden candlesticks, the inscribed scrolls, and most heartbreakingly, the white fragrant plum blossom, a treasured relic said to embody the spirit of Mount Hua. It had been sold, reduced to a mere transaction. The weight of it all, loss, shame, and helpless rage, crushed him. Chung Myung, once a guardian of a proud legacy, stood amidst its ashes. His vision blurred, his knees buckled, and the world faded to black. Mount Hua was not just broken, it was desecrated. Chapter 7. The child arrived alone, exhausted, and collapsed within the crumbling auction temple. His body bore no wounds, only the toll of starvation and the punishing climb up Mount Hua. The elders of the sect, Hyunjong and Unam, watched over him with concern. It was strange, they agreed, few children would know the path to their secluded mountain, let alone brave it alone. Moved to the Plum Blossom Hall, the child remained unconscious as the elders speculated about his origins. Unam shared how the boy had spoken of selling plum blossoms and asked about Mount Hua's martial lineage before fainting. That name, Chung Myung, echoed in Hyunjong's thoughts. It belonged to the Plum Blossom Sword Saint, one of Mount Hua's most revered warriors, lost during the Great War. A name now carried by a boy lying in their care. Beneath the calm exterior, Chung Myung seethed. The sect was in ruins. Treasures once sacred had been sold. Auction Temple, once a cornerstone of Mount Hua, was gutted to its bones. Even martial techniques were warped beyond recognition. The proud legacy he remembered was reduced to rubble. Yet the worst pain came not from what was lost, but from his own helplessness. Though his mind held centuries of knowledge, his body was weak, a child's frame unfit for battle. He couldn't reveal his identity. No one would believe him, and if they did, they might see him as a threat or a fraud. He had to bide his time, teach in secret, rebuild quietly. He looked to the horizon, where the mountain peaks pierced the sky like ancient blades. Once, he had stood among them, a master of martial arts, the pride of Mount Hua. Now, he was a boy among ruins, carrying the weight of a fallen sect and the burden of redemption. But he had made his choice. He would repay Mount Hua. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but for the honor of the teachings that made him who he was. If it meant starting from nothing, so be it. The elders above muttered in guilt and sorrow, unable to recognize the boy for who he truly was. Meanwhile, the real Chung Myung, reborn yet unseen, clenched his fists with determination. Mount Hua will rise again, he swore. Chapter 8. Mount Hua was in ruins, and the weight of its decline sat heavily on Chung Myung's shoulders. The boy, once revered as the Plum Blossom Sword Saint, wandered the decaying grounds in silence. The proud sect he once knew now barely held itself together. Even Unam, a senior of the sect, eyed him with suspicion, misreading his strange behavior as the hardened edge of a life lived as a beggar. Called before the sect leader, Chung Myung entered with caution. Hyunjong sat calmly, a presence steeped in discipline but dulled by years of decline. The moment stirred strange emotions in Chung Myung. In his past life, this room had echoed with the voices of titans, now it felt like a relic of lost glory. Hyunjong, however, saw no need for tests or probing questions. He simply welcomed the boy. Chung Myung had prepared an elaborate tale, one involving a lost disciple, a woodcutter, and secret martial arts passed through generations, but the opportunity never came. The sect leader extended acceptance immediately, unmoved by caution or suspicion. Even Unam, startled, questioned the decision. But Hyunjong stood firm. Mount Hua could not turn away those who sought it with sincerity, even in its decline. He declared that one's past life held no weight upon setting foot on the mountain. To the young boy before him, this was more bewildering than reassuring. The acceptance felt too easy, too unguarded, and it pierced deeper than any interrogation would have. Given lodging and a name already held in esteem, Chung Myung was declared a disciple once more, this time, the youngest of Mount Hua. The name, his real one, held meaning to the sect, though they no longer remembered why. Hyunjong took it as fate. As Unam led him outside, the broken walls and faded banners told a story of loss. Yet through it all, Chung Myung could only laugh. He had achieved his goal, yet the truth of it cut deeper than expected. To walk again in the place he once defended, now stripped of memory and honor, was no simple victory. And so he laughed with tears in his eyes, not out of joy, but from the painful irony of being reborn into the ashes of his former glory. He had returned to Mount Hua. But what remained of it? Chapter 9. Hyunjong sat quietly as Unam, his longtime assistant, struggled with the sect leader's latest decision. The acceptance of a young, distant boy, Chung Myung, seemed senseless amidst Mount Hua's dire state. The sect was crumbling, resources thinning, and now was hardly the time to take in someone so unremarkable, so unfitting. Yet Hyunjong's eyes held faith. "Plum blossoms bloom even in snow," he said, his voice calm, heavy with quiet hope. He saw in the boy a flicker of something more, a chance, no matter how faint, that the sect might one day rise again. As the conversation ended, Unam left with a sigh, burdened by doubts. The weight of Mount Hua's decline pressed against his heart like never before. Elsewhere, Chung Myung examined the stiff white robe draped over him. It itched like it was spun from thorns. In a time long past, Mount Hua had wealth, enough to dress its disciples in honor. Now even the clothes reflected decay. He remembered treasures, pride, discipline. All gone. He had returned not to the Mount Hua of his memory, but a faded remnant in survival mode. Stepping into the corridor, he discovered the unfamiliar dormitory setup. Mount Hua, in his time, had no such system. Disciples used to live under their masters. Now, the rooms were sparse, barely livable. Opening a door nearby, he noticed signs of another occupant. Just then, a child his age appeared, glaring. "Jo Gul." Others quickly joined, shouting accusations of intrusion. Though older in spirit than any of them, Chung Myung was without martial power for now, reborn and starting again. A stern voice cut through the noise. Yun Geometry, a teacher, descended with authority that sent the children scattering. Chung Myung, unfamiliar with the structure and customs of this new Mount Hua, drew attention. The teacher explained, this was the White Plum Blossom boarding house, home to young disciples. Despite Chung Myung's confusion, he knew one thing: to restore Mount Hua, he had to endure. The teacher ordered him to join training. Though he knew the drills were beneath him, they were necessary stepping stones. As the others moved ahead, Jo Gul threw him a challenge, a threat masked in a promise to fight. Chung Myung simply watched, amused. These children, rough as they were, carried the lineage of the sect he once gave everything to protect. They didn't know who he truly was. Not yet. With a small, determined smile, he followed after them. Chapter 10. Chung Myung walked beside Yin Geometry, his gaze sharp and observant. Unlike most newcomers, he didn't shrink in unfamiliar surroundings. Irritation fueled his steps rather than fear. As they passed through Mount Hua's stone corridors, he noticed the peculiar setup of the White Plum Blossom Dormitory, a centralized boarding house for all disciples. It betrayed Mount Hua's old traditions, where disciples learned intimately under individual masters. This change, born from necessity during the sect's decline, spoke volumes. Disciples who once carried the legacy had abandoned Mount Hua. The few who remained consolidated teaching for efficiency, breaking lineage and core instruction. While Yun Geometry tried to mask the reasons, Chung Myung saw through it. Mount Hua had become a sinking ship long ago. The training hall loomed ahead, once bustling with pride, now sparsely filled. Disciples moved in unison, executing the equilibrium of six-sword technique. At first glance, the discipline impressed him. But as the session progressed, unease crept in. This swordsmanship, despite its complexity, was unsuited for novices. Teaching it to beginners was like forcing them to recite poetry without understanding the alphabet. Chung Myung watched, frustrated. The very foundations were wrong. These shortcuts, chosen in desperation, would only ruin the next generation. And yet, this flawed approach had somehow become the standard. He joined the line at the back, silent but simmering. When asked why he wasn't participating, he simply stated he didn't know the technique. The senior disciple dismissed him easily, focusing again on the others. Later, a disciple confronted him with veiled hostility, recognizing him as a newcomer. Their exchange revealed a grim truth: after mastering the current sword technique, disciples progressed through a series of other styles, including one called the Tai Flummox sword. But the true technique of Mount Hua, the 24 Plum Blossom Sword, was unheard of. No one even knew its name. Chung Myung's heart sank. He remembered a time when that very technique was Mount Hua's pride. Its absence wasn't an accident. He recalled a conversation from his past. Leaders had deliberately discarded the technique, deeming it obsolete. They had cast aside the core of Mount Hua, replacing it with ornamental, ineffective methods. As the sky stretched clear and blue above him, Chung Myung stood still, heavy with the realization. Mount Hua was worse off than he imagined. No legacy. No guidance. Only ruins wearing the mask of tradition. And now, alone, he would have to carry the burden of restoration, against time, decay, and a sect that no longer remembered itself. Chapter 11. Chung Myung's return to the dorms was steeped in disappointment. The Mount Hua Sect, once revered, had decayed beyond recognition. The halls echoed not with discipline but with emptiness: no funds, no energy, and worst of all, no memory of its legendary martial arts. The treasured 24 Plum Blossom Sword was nowhere to be found. Even with a previous generation wiped out, how could they let their legacy vanish? He sighed, aching from extra training punishment. If only he still had his former strength, climbing the mountain wouldn't have left his body so worn. Yet what weighed heavier was the state of the sect. Instead of disciplined martial artists, he found hollow philosophy and lazy posturing. His role now was as a lowly third-class disciple, stripped of authority but filled with vision. Mount Hua needed revival, and he had no time to waste. Returning hungry and tired, he entered the dorm. There, a group of senior disciples waited, their smug faces betraying ill intent. At their center stood Jo Gul, full of mockery. They demanded that Chung Myung report, a thin excuse for hazing masked as tradition. The air was thick with their amusement, treating cruelty as camaraderie. He looked around, then at the warped ceiling above. He had to live here now. These were his so-called seniors. That thought alone settled something inside him. Jo Gul stepped forward, grabbing his collar, justifying the act as discipline. But before his words could finish, Chung Myung's fist crashed into his jaw. Jo Gul soared upward, smashing through the ceiling with a bone-rattling crack. The room froze. Chung Myung walked calmly to the door, slid the bolt shut, then turned back with a faint smile. The broken chair leg in his hand was enough. He didn't speak out of anger. His voice was calm, decisive. Mount Hua wouldn't be rebuilt on rot. Before changing the world, he would clean his immediate surroundings. No room for tyranny disguised as hierarchy. He reminded them, almost gently, that since they were seniors, they'd be treated accordingly, with a double dose if they screamed. And with that, he began. Each swing was a statement: Mount Hua would not be bullied from within. As wood splintered and pride shattered, the message became clear: Chung Myung had arrived, and he would not be broken. Chapter 12. The atmosphere in the dormitory was heavy. Chung Myung, though appearing the youngest, had made it clear he was now in control. Yoon Jong, his so-called senior, was massaging his shoulders with swollen eyes, while the rest of the disciples knelt in subdued silence. Chung Myung had broken their pride effortlessly, not with cruelty, but with an overwhelming presence none of them could resist. Once hailed among the greatest martial artists before his death, Chung Myung saw through their posturing. These were not devoted disciples but scattered youths lacking discipline. His brief physical reprimand wasn't random, it was calculated, and it worked. You should strive to live with purpose, he reminded them, his voice low but sharp. They nodded, more out of fear than understanding. Among them, Jo Gul caught his eye, the one most informed about Mount Hua's current condition. In private, Jo Gul explained. Most disciples were sons of merchants, not traditional devotees. They came not to serve the sect, but to gain skills and status, planning to leave once they had what they needed. The loyalty that once bound Mount Hua had eroded with time and misfortune. Chung Myung listened quietly, the memories of a once thriving sect flashing in his mind. He remembered the older days, when the disciples lived with passion and discipline, when they saw Mount Hua as a lifelong calling, not a stepping stone. With a sigh, he dismissed Zhou Gul, giving him one final order: inform everyone that training would begin at dawn, not 7, but 5. The look of dismay on Zhou Gul's face didn't faze him. As the footsteps faded beyond the wall, Chung Myung lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't the glorious sect he once knew. It was fractured, misguided, and lost in decay. But every journey began with a single step. If Mount Hua was to rise again, it would start here, with these misfit disciples, and with him, once more walking the road. Chapter 13. At the break of dawn, Chung Myung rose with a sense of clarity coursing through him. His inner core, once frail, now pulsed with vibrant energy. With every breath, his body resonated, purified by the cleanest energy he had ever known in all his lifetimes. The path to power was unfolding, but slowly. And Mount Hua did not have the luxury of time. Mount Hua was crumbling. It was plagued by poverty, decaying martial traditions, and most critically, a lack of promising disciples. Wealth and techniques could be recovered, but talent was irreplaceable. Chung Myung knew he couldn't scour the world for prodigies. He would have to make do with what he had, train the untrained, mold the broken. He remembered being asked once how he would teach disciples. His answer had been blunt: discipline through strength. Now, without warning, he found himself responsible for dozens of ill-prepared students. The morning air was filled with groans and complaints. The disciples, mostly from comfortable families, were unaccustomed to hardship. Yet despite their grumbling, they gathered as ordered. The fear from last night's incident, when Chung Myung single-handedly subdued them with a chair leg, still lingered. They whispered, confused and wary, staring at strange training tools laid before them. Sand pouches, wooden rods, heavy pebbles, none understood their purpose. The air tensed as Chung Myung emerged from the dormitory, irritation flickering in his eyes. He surveyed the group and declared that from this day forward, they would train together every morning. His tone was calm, but the weight behind it silenced all objections. When a few dared to question the necessity, he gave them the choice to leave. They did. Cheerfully, even. But as they stepped into the dorm with him, the building soon trembled subtly, and a chill crept over the others watching. No screams echoed. Only silence. Then, moments later, the same few fled out, pale and breathless, and rejoined the line without another word. The message was clear: resistance was futile. With eerie enthusiasm, Chung Myung proclaimed his mission to make them strong. The disciples stood silently, dreading what was to come. Yoon Jong, the senior among them, watched the rising sun with closed eyes. Mount Hua's future, he realized, might be bright, but their immediate path was anything but. Chapter 14. Morning light pierced through the windows of Ungeometry's quarters, stirring him from rest. A frown creased his face. No disciple had come to greet or wake him. A tradition, though old, was rarely broken. Concerned, he quickly dressed and headed toward the white Plum Blossom dormitory. As he turned the corner, Ungeometry halted, eyes widening in disbelief. The training yard looked like a battlefield. His disciples were scattered across the ground, gasping for air, their robes soaked in sweat and faces drawn in exhaustion. Gone were the youthful, eager faces he had taught. What lay before him resembled broken remnants, limbs trembling, bodies limp, moans echoing in the air. These weren't strangers. These were his students. Wooden training swords and dirt-filled pouches lay discarded nearby. Panic twisted in his chest. What had happened here? A few groaned out his name with tears in their eyes. Their suffering wasn't feigned. It was real. And their gazes, desperate and pleading, pointed to the back. There, standing alone, was the new boy, Chung Myung. The child bore a wooden rod over his shoulders, heavy bags of dirt dangling on either side. His body trembled under the strain, muscles taut, veins pulsing, face contorted with effort. Step by step, he endured, squatting, rising, sweat pouring like rain. Even the toughest of Mount Hua's teachings hadn't produced something like this. Geometry's breath caught. This training went beyond harsh. Even he, a strict believer in rigorous conditioning, saw the line being crossed. The other disciples, even the strongest like Zhou Gul and Yun Zhang, lay collapsed, completely drained. Yun Zhang looked hollow, soul nearly gone. And yet Chung Myung continued. The reason was clear. The disciples hadn't overslept, they'd been training under Chung Myung since dawn, and it had broken them. Why no one stopped it? Because none dared to. Geometry swallowed hard. This wasn't rebellion or foolishness. This was raw, relentless discipline radiating from one boy, discipline powerful enough to shake 100 students. He turned to the others, their eyes pleading for salvation. In that moment, the name Chung Myung etched itself into Geometry's mind. He didn't yet realize it would come to define everything. Chapter 15. Beneath the blue sky, Geometry watched as young disciples stood drenched and trembling. At the center stood Chung Myung, barely upright, clothes soaked, face flushed from exertion. Despite his fragile appearance, something about him unsettled the seasoned instructor. Chung Myung asked for water rather than rest, his composure eerily calm. When questioned, he explained the early morning training had been voluntary, just a shared desire to improve. But as he glanced back, the older disciples froze in fear, unwilling to contradict him. Geometry, no stranger to reading children, immediately recognized the truth. This wasn't motivation. It was dominance. Yet he hesitated to call it out. Acknowledging that the older students had been pressured by a newcomer would only humiliate them further. Chung Myung then proposed a deal, 1 month. He would continue this private training, and Geometry could judge the results later. It was a confident request, not from a child, but someone accustomed to leading. And with Mount Hua's limited staff, Geometry saw an opportunity. The sect lacked enough instructors, and if this boy could instill discipline and drive into the others, it might relieve some of the burden. Curious, Geometry asked why Chung Myung put himself through such strain. The answer was simple: to grow stronger. Entering Mount Hua was just the beginning. True strength required effort beyond formal lessons, even if it meant sacrificing sleep. This logic aligned with Mount Hua's own philosophies. With a faint smile, Geometry turned to the others. He praised their supposed voluntary effort, commending their dedication. The disciples' expressions twisted in silent agony as realization dawned: he was siding with the monster in their midst. Then, with a final grin, Geometry excused himself from morning duties. They were on their own now. As the disciples stood frozen in dread, a sound cracked through the air. Chung Myung was loosening his knuckles. That grin on his face was cheerful, but the tension on his forehead told another story. He summoned them for a chat before breakfast. And just like that, Mount Hua's youngest disciple marched them back inside, leaving behind the innocent dreams they once held. Chapter 16. Mount Hua, once a proud martial sect, now stood hollow and fragile, its halls echoing with fading legacy. Within a quiet chamber, Am and Geometry reflected on recent events. The boy, Chung Myung, had arrived unexpectedly, uninvited, unnamed, yet accepted without hesitation by the sect leader, who had once vowed never to take another disciple. Am had assumed there was some hidden plan behind the boy's acceptance. However, he came to realize that the child had arrived of his own will, driven by a motive none of them fully understood. Despite his youth and abrupt entrance, the boy had quickly unsettled the long-standing stillness of Mount Hua. Though strange, his presence seemed to herald change, an unfamiliar but necessary disturbance for a sect that had grown too quiet, too brittle. Both, weighed by uncertainty, chose to observe rather than obstruct. Beyond the quiet halls, Mount Hua's third-class disciples were enduring an entirely new kind of torment. Their muscles trembled, arms refused to steady, and even lifting a bowl of stir-fried vegetables had become a Herculean task. Chung Myung's intense physical training had left them drained, their bodies unprepared for the relentless strain he demanded. Though many grumbled in private, few had the courage to speak their frustrations aloud. The air was thick with exhaustion and quiet resentment. Even so, Chung Myung showed no signs of slowing, nor did he offer any justification. He worked harder than all of them combined, repeating exercises with weights heavier than his own body. Among the disciples, Jo-gul had once been the loudest voice of complaint. But something had changed in him. Observing Chung Myung's effort, far beyond expectation, discipline, or ego, he had begun to see things differently. Where others saw torment, he saw a chance for transformation. He no longer viewed the harsh training as punishment but as a doorway to strength he had never thought possible. Seeking clarity, he spoke with Yoon-jong in private. There, the two shared an unspoken truth: they had never truly pushed themselves to their limits before. What they once thought was effort paled in comparison to what Chung Myung demonstrated daily. The boy was younger, yet stronger, not through luck but sheer determination. It was this realization that stirred something within them both. Yoon-jong, already resolved to remain with Mount Hua until the end, recognized that this strange, tireless disciple might be the key to renewal. Jo-gul, seeing hope where before there was only resignation, asked for nothing more than a chance to grow alongside him. Together, the two made a quiet vow. They would follow Chung Myung, not because of who he was, but because of what he represented, the possibility of revival. Whether the wind he brought would steady their ship or tear it apart, they were ready to set sail. Unseen, someone watched them from afar, silently bearing witness to the moment Mount Hua began to stir once more. Chapter 17. Chung Myung hid in the trees, watching his fellow disciples with a rice ball in hand. Lying back, he sighed. His original plan had been to lay low, but his unexpected actions had stirred things up. His presence in Mount Hua was already causing more chaos than he'd intended, and the disciples had no idea what they were getting into. His eyes followed Yoon-jong and Jo-gul as they entered the dining hall. There was something remarkable about them. Despite the brutal training they had endured, especially Jo-gul, they didn't complain. They thrived on the hardship, pushing themselves to grow stronger. Chung Myung could see their potential, and it made him smile. If he could help them, they would be great assets. But his thoughts quickly returned to himself. With a young body and all his past martial arts knowledge, Chung Myung knew the most important thing was strengthening his body. Without the physical strength to back up his skills, no technique could reach its full potential. He needed to build muscle, to make his body as powerful as the sword he wielded. Only then could Mount Hua sword techniques truly shine. But as he examined the current state of Mount Hua, his optimism began to wane. The martial arts being taught were outdated, useless. Jo-gul had handed him a list of techniques, and Chung Myung had gone through them with a sense of disbelief. None of these would help them. The Tai Flummox sword, the sect's current focus, fell far short of his standards. While he fumed, Jo-gul revealed that the demonic cult had attacked Mount Hua, setting fire to the west building. Chung Myung's heart skipped a beat. He knew well the dark history of Mount Hua, the destruction that had followed the death of the heavenly demon. The fire had been part of a larger plot of vengeance from the cult. Jo-gul mentioned the Plum Blossom Swordsmen, whose death of the heavenly demon was legendary, but Jo-gul clarified that no one truly knew what had happened. The only thing he knew for certain was that Mount Hua had been destroyed. Then Chung Myung laughed. Jo-gul looked at him, confused by his sudden change in demeanor. But Chung Myung couldn't stop laughing. It was a bitter, hollow laugh. The weight of it all hit him. The fall of Mount Hua, was it really his fault? As he stood up, his mind buzzed with frustration and regret. But he also felt a renewed determination. The path ahead was unclear, but he couldn't let Mount Hua's fate be sealed. He would train, rebuild, and if necessary, face the consequences of his past actions. Chapter 18. Chung Myung sat in quiet contemplation, his thoughts clouded by the realization that the aftermath of his actions had led to the downfall of Mount Hua. The survivors from the demon sect, those who had witnessed the heavenly demon's death at his hands, were now seeking vengeance. He couldn't shake the frustration and sense of helplessness that gnawed at him. His mission, once filled with hope, had resulted in this ruin. No one he knew had survived, and those who were left had to pay the price for his actions. Jo Gul noticed Chung Myung's turmoil but remained silent, not daring to disturb him. Chung Myung's anger simmered as he processed the destruction of Mount Hua, knowing that the sect's martial arts were left in tatters. His shoulders slumped, the weight of it all pressing down on him. The young disciples, innocent and unaware of the gravity of the past, were now facing the consequences. As the night fell, Chung Myung took a deep breath and decided to walk away from the chaos, needing space to clear his mind. But as he left, his thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and rage. How could the demon sect, after losing their heavenly demon, come back to destroy Mount Hua? His mind wandered back to the sect's ruin, and he realized it wasn't just the war that had caused the collapse, but the failure of leadership that allowed such a downfall. Walking through the empty halls of the sect, Chung Myung found himself standing before the main gate, where an unusual noise erupted. A group of people was aggressively hammering at the gate. Their behavior was utterly disrespectful. How dare they demand the sect leader in this manner? In the past, such insolence would have been met with swift retribution, but now, the elders appeared helpless. As the gate finally gave way to the violent crowd, Chung Myung's mind raced. The audacity of these intruders stunned him. He looked on in disbelief as they stormed the residence of the sect leader, shouting their demands for repayment. His gaze shifted to the elders, who seemed unable to block the crowd despite their strength. The scene was surreal. The sect leader, Hyunjong, finally emerged, attempting to maintain a calm composure in the face of such an uproar. His dignified presence, however, was not enough to quell the fury of the mob. They were relentless in their demands, and Chung Myung could only watch as Hyunjong faltered. The true reason for the sect's collapse came to light: financial ruin. Mount Hua was not only struggling against the aftermath of the demon sect's revenge but also drowning in debt. Chung Myung felt a deep, sinking despair. Mount Hua had fallen not just because of the enemies they faced but because of the neglect and mismanagement that had left them vulnerable to such a fate. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes drifted upward, the cloudy sky reflecting his internal storm. Tears threatened to spill as he thought about the fate of his once proud sect. He had sacrificed everything for Mount Hua, but in the end, it seemed the cost was too great. Chapter 19. Chung Myung watched in silence as the merchant group, led by Kong, the owner of Tae Hua Pavilion in Hua Village, gathered. They were a powerful force, demanding Mount Hua repay the loan it owed. Hyunjong, the sect leader, tried to maintain his calm, but the weight of the debt burden was clear on his face. Kong had come in person, his tone polite but edged with impatience. The debt was long overdue, and Kong had given Mount Hua 7 days to pay or face the consequences of the contract. Hyunjong's face betrayed his fear as Kong outlined the terms. Despite his calm demeanor, the sect leader knew Mount Hua had no way to repay the loan. Kong's group would not wait much longer. The situation was dire, and with every passing second, Mount Hua's future seemed to slip further away. Chung Myung sat still, absorbing the news. The situation felt like a betrayal. Mount Hua's own business, Tae Hua Pavilion, was now being used against them. It was incomprehensible. The business that should have been an asset to the sect had become a tool for its destruction. This twisted reality filled Chung Myung with frustration and anger, stirring a deep determination within him. His mind raced with thoughts of how things had gone wrong. Mount Hua's finances had always been a struggle, but this was something else. How could they allow a situation like this to happen? It didn't make sense. A surge of energy coursed through him as he rose from his seat, a burning desire to uncover the truth. Joe Ghoul, noticing the change in Chung Myung, watched with concern. The playful and carefree disciple had been replaced by someone more intense, more driven. Chung Myung, his resolve hardening, knew he had to act. Mount Hua's very survival was at stake, and he could not stand by while its fate hung in the balance. Chung Myung changed into black robes, a symbol of his determination. He had to find out what had gone wrong. The sect's finances, the debts, and the betrayal, it was all too much to ignore. He had to understand how Mount Hua, a sect built on tradition and pride, had been reduced to this state. Yun Zhang, who had been observing from the sidelines, understood the gravity of the situation. He feared the chaos Chung Myung might cause if he left the mountain. His impulsive nature could lead to disaster, especially outside the sect's walls. Yun Zhang had tried to stop him, to remind him of his responsibilities as a disciple, but it was clear that Chung Myung would not be deterred. As Chung Myung made his way toward the door, Yun Zhang realized there was no turning back. Mount Hua's problems were now Chung Myung's fight, and the outcome was uncertain. The storm was coming, and Chung Myung was at its center, ready to confront the forces threatening his sect. Chapter 20. Huam Village, located beneath Mount Hua, had once thrived due to the sect's prominence, but with Mount Hua's decline, the village's vitality had also faded. Despite this, Tehua Pavilion, owned by Kong Myung, remained a stronghold. On the top floor of the pavilion, Kong and a group of merchants gathered, discussing their actions regarding Mount Hua's growing debt. Kong, though appearing sympathetic, revealed his true intentions to exploit the sect's fragile state for personal gain. As Kong smiled, concealing his true thoughts, the merchants voiced their support for his decision to issue an ultimatum to the failing sect. Kong, recognizing Mount Hua's historical significance, planned to capitalize on its legacy. Despite its decline, Mount Hua's name still held value, and Kong saw potential in it as a tourist attraction or as an asset to be sold to rivals. Yu Zhongsan, a silk merchant, was particularly eager about the financial gains they would make once Mount Hua's debt was recovered. The money was immense, and the interest had accumulated for years. But as they spoke, a strange interruption occurred. Kong, feeling an unusual sense of unease, was startled when he thought he saw someone in the vicinity. However, the guards found nothing when they investigated. The merchants dismissed the incident, and soon they all decided to leave, but Yu Zhongsan, drunk with excitement, wandered down the streets, still caught up in the looming wealth. His journey led him into a dark alley, where a masked figure suddenly appeared, blocking his path. The figure seemed like a robber, but Yu Zhongsan, still intoxicated, dismissed the threat, bragging about his bodyguards. Soon, Yu Zhongsan's bodyguards emerged, but the masked figure wasn't intimidated. Despite their warnings, the figure remained calm and only asked Yu Zhongsan to answer his questions. However, the bodyguards were quick to act, surrounding the figure. They intended to capture him, but the masked man, with lightning speed, disabled them all. One by one, the bodyguards fell to the ground, foaming at the mouth, helpless against the figure's power. Yu Zhongsan, now sober and fearful, realized the gravity of the situation as the masked man approached him. The figure, who had easily dispatched the guards, now turned his attention to Yu Zhongsan. He asked again, this time in a calm but menacing tone, for answers. Yu Zhongsan, cornered and defeated, quickly complied, understanding that the situation had escalated beyond his control.